Welcome to another Crafting with Roswell. Today we will be making tissue paper art. In your kit you'll receive one sheet of watercolor paper, a sponge paintbrush, and tissue paper squares. You will also need paper towels, scissors, potentially, a table covering or something on your surface, and water. For suggested extras, you can use permanent marker to add designs to your finished work once dry. You can use a white crayon to create resist areas where the dye from the tissue paper will not be seen on your sheet of watercolor paper. It'll appear white like the paper still. And you can also use different paint brushes and different types of different colors of tissue paper beyond what I provided in your kit if you so choose. The different paint brushes would help you in smaller areas add detail. That's completely optional. And I also suggested like yarn or an embroidery thread. So I am going to be making a bookmark with all of you, but you could easily punch a hole in the top and then add a little extra to this by creating a tassel out of yarn or thread, just as an idea. Your sheet can also be cut to make greeting cards, gift tags, pretty versatile in what you can use the watercolor paper for. And so this is just a neat way to paint and get a watercolor effect without actually using paints. So then I'll start by saying it's very important to actually use tissue paper that does what they call bleeding. So essentially the dye from our tissue paper is going to be wet, and that water effect will drain the ink off of our tissue paper squares, and the watercolor paper will then absorb it. If your tissue paper is not the kind where the dye is set to bleed or leave the actual tissue paper squares, you're not going to be able to achieve this effect. Which look on our Instagram for my blooper reel about trying this with tissue paper that does not actually help you create this effect. You end up with a white piece of wet paper. Not kind of the look we're going for. So here's my sample. So I just took a bunch of squares, placed them on, and I'm going to show you how I did this. Once it's dry or almost dry, you pull the tissue paper off, then this dries, and there is a cool watercolor print. I think this is super pretty for note cards, super pretty for bookmarks, great little extra for a gift, and a great project for the youngsters in your life too. A little less mess, not having all the paints to clean up, but you still get the effect very colorful. All right, so let's get started. So once you decide if you want to actually just cover your entire sheet with tissue paper squares, or if you want to cut out bookmarks ahead of time, have your bookmarks be different from each other. If you want to have note cards and focus on one note card at a time, I recommend cutting out your shapes before you start doing your steps with the tissue paper. But up first is adding a little water. So it doesn't have to be soaking wet, but you just want a nice layer of water on your surface. Enough that when you place your tissue paper on it, it's going to hold your tissue paper and you'll see your tissue paper change colors. And as soon as you start touching this with your fingers, I recommend having the paper towels or the baby wipes nearby, just because the dye is going to transfer potentially to your fingers. So right now you can see this piece of blue is added, and I just have a little bit of water on top. And you can already see along the sides that blue is traveling out of that paper and onto the watercolor. Sorry, I forgot where my camera was. My camera was for a second there. So you can already see the blue is coming off. And this is why I recommend having rinse water and a paper towel, just because in between tissue paper pieces, you might find that you want to give your brush a little refresh. So in your kit, you have the bigger sponge brush, and this is going to work perfectly fine, but consider rinsing it in between color pieces. That way you're not going to end up with, say, a brown bookmark or a brown card, unless it's the intent that you have going into your project, just because all the colors are going to start mixing. And when they mix, then you usually end up with grays, blacks, and browns as your creation. So I'm just going to go ahead to show you another piece. So this is a brighter pink. I'm going to overlap them slightly. And you're going to also find when you overlap colors, the two color dyes are going to mix in. So this could end up looking like a purple on the bookmark. If I want to add in a green, I don't wet the whole bookmark. I just kind of work in sections. Otherwise, you're going to find it drying out before you get to an area. So I just kind of rinse my brush and add the paper as I go. You can have the paper hanging off the side. You can line up the edges. They won't be crisp with the way that the watercolor paper draws the dye through, but you'll get the idea. I was going to say I'll use another one of these pinks. And so I place it on and I just add a little bit of water over it. And that really gets the dyeing process. You can see the green from this one. It's kind of tie-dyed itself into the pink. Your colors are really going to start blending. So they recommend letting this dry before you remove your tissue paper to get a stronger color. You can also use a hairdryer to speed up the dry time if you're feeling a little impatient and you want to see your final creation. You can always pull out the handy hairdryer. So you can see the pink and the yellow in this corner are kind of mixing to be like an orange. And every creation is going to look a little different. I'll just finish out this corner with a nice darker blue. And this is where your scissors would come in handy for trimming off little pieces if you wanted to. So like this little bit of pink, pinkish purple, if I want to pull that off, cut that off the side, I can. And then I can come down here and add it to another place so none of your tissue paper is wasted. And you're going to see this is curling from all the moisture that it's absorbing. But it will then come back to more of a flat when it's dried. And you can always push it flat even further by having a little weight on top of it with a pile of books. So just making sure these are all a little wet. In any of these little in-between areas, if you just run your wet paintbrush through, you're going to get more colors interacting and kind of filling in some of those white spaces with a little more of the color from your tissue paper. And just for the sake of the video, so you don't have to wait, I'm going to go ahead and start pulling off. And when you see if it's darker in areas, when it's still wet, you have the chance to kind of move the dye around to make a few changes. And so there's an example of tissue paper art. So definitely just get creative before you plan your project. Double check in a small corner if you're supplying your own tissue paper that your tissue paper will actually do what it's supposed to for this project, and just have the dye transfer onto the watercolor paper. And I actually stayed pretty clean today, so that's awesome too. So here is my bookmark. And once these are all dry, then you can get extra creative, adding sayings, drawings on top if you wanted to, or honestly, they're pretty just the way they are. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'll be back again next Wednesday with another project.